17-year-old Zara Williams had perfected the art of invisibility at Riverside High School. What she didn't know was that her father, Staff Sergeant Marcus Williams, had been watching the security footage from his deployment overseas. And when bullies finally crossed the line by humiliating his daughter in the cafeteria, this decorated Marine was about to teach them a lesson they'd never forget. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. The morning sun cast long shadows across the parking lot of Riverside High School in Cedar Falls, Georgia, as students began filtering in for another day of classes. Among them walked Zara Williams, her dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, books clutched tightly against her chest as she navigated through clusters of chattering teenagers. At 17, Zara possessed a quiet elegance that might have made her popular in different circumstances, but she had learned early that standing out at Riverside High was rarely a good thing. Zara had been at Riverside for 2 years now, ever since her family moved to Cedar Falls when her father received his promotion to staff sergeant. The transition had been particularly difficult because it came just as her father deployed to overseas duty, leaving Zara and her mother, Dr. Angela Williams, to navigate their new community alone. While her mother threw herself into her work at the local medical center, establishing herself as one of the area's most respected pediatricians, Zara had chosen a different strategy for survival: complete invisibility. The Williams family had always been different from their neighbors in Cedar Falls. Dr. Williams was one of only 3 black physicians in the entire county, and Staff Sergeant Williams was the only black Marine recruiter in the region before his deployment. Their house, a modest but well-maintained colonial on Maple Street, stood out not for its size but for the precision with which it was maintained. Every blade of grass was perfectly trimmed, every surface spotless, reflecting the military discipline that Marcus Williams had instilled in his family even from thousands of miles away. Zara's bedroom told the story of a girl caught between worlds. Her desk held perfect rows of academic awards and honor roll certificates, evidence of the 3.8 GPA she maintained without ever raising her hand in class. Above her desk hung a map of the world with red pins marking every base where her father had been stationed throughout her childhood. Fort Bragg, Camp Pendleton, Quantico. Each pin represented a move, a new school, a fresh start that required her to rebuild her identity from scratch. The wall beside her bed displayed a different kind of collection: photographs of her father in dress blues, letters written on military stationery, and a folded American flag that had belonged to her grandfather, who served in Vietnam. These items weren't just decorations. They were reminders of a legacy of service and strength that Zara carried with her even when she felt most alone. At Riverside High, however, none of this mattered. The students here had grown up together, formed their social circles in elementary school, and saw little reason to adjust their hierarchies for newcomers. Zara had quickly learned that being the new girl was challenging enough without adding the complexities of being one of only 15 black students in a school of 1,200. The social dynamics at Riverside operated with the brutal efficiency of any small-town high school. The popular crowds centered around the football team and cheerleaders, their territory clearly marked by the premium tables in the cafeteria and the best parking spots in the student lot. Below them existed various subcategories: the drama kids, the band students, the academic achievers, and scattered throughout, the invisible ones like Zara, who had learned that anonymity was often the safest option. Zara's daily routine had become a carefully choreographed dance designed to minimize contact with potential problems. She arrived at school exactly 7 minutes before the first bell, late enough to avoid the early morning social gathering but early enough to get to her locker without rushing. Her locker, number 247, was strategically chosen during registration, located in a less trafficked hallway where she could gather her books without attracting attention. Her class schedule reflected both her academic ambitions and her survival instincts. Advanced placement courses naturally had smaller enrollments and more serious students, creating environments where her quiet diligence was more likely to be respected than ridiculed. She excelled in AP Literature, where her essays consistently earned praise from Mrs. Henderson, who had taught at Riverside for 23 years and had a reputation for being impossible to impress. In AP Chemistry, Zara worked with a precision that reminded her of her father's military training. Every measurement exact, every procedure followed to the letter, every lab report submitted with the kind of attention to detail that would have made Staff Sergeant Williams proud. Her lab partner, Kevin Chen, was one of the few students who had attempted to break through her careful barriers, but Zara had learned to keep even potential friendships at a safe distance. Mathematics had always been Zara's strongest subject, a fact that both helped and hindered her social integration. Her performance in AP Calculus was so consistently excellent that other students occasionally asked for help, but these interactions rarely extended beyond academic necessity. She would explain a concept clearly and patiently, then retreat back into her protective shell before any real connection could form. The lunch period represented Zara's greatest daily challenge. The cafeteria at Riverside High was a social minefield where every table assignment carried meaning and every seat choice was scrutinized. Zara had solved this problem by claiming a small table near the windows, positioned so she could see most of the room while keeping her back to a wall. She ate quickly and quietly, usually finishing her meal in less than 10 minutes before retreating to the library for the remainder of the period. Her typical lunch consisted of a sandwich her mother had prepared the night before, usually turkey or ham on wheat bread, cut diagonally and wrapped in aluminum foil. Dr. Williams included little notes in Zara's lunch bag, written on prescription pad paper in her distinctive physician's handwriting. "Proud of you always," or "Remember you're stronger than you know." These small messages served as daily reminders that someone believed in her even when she struggled to believe in herself. The library had become Zara's sanctuary, a place where her love of reading was an asset rather than a liability. Mrs. Patterson, the librarian, had noticed Zara's daily visits and began setting aside new arrivals that might interest her. Historical fiction, biographies of strong women, books about military families. These became Zara's escape from the social pressures of high school life. After school, Zara's routine continued with the same careful precision. She would walk home along the same route every day, past the small park where military families sometimes gathered for community events, past the strip mall where her mother occasionally stopped for groceries, past the houses of classmates who had never invited her inside. The 20-minute walk gave her time to decompress from the day's social navigation and prepare for the quiet evening ahead. Evenings in the Williams household were structured around Dr. Angela Williams' demanding schedule. As one of the county's few pediatric specialists, she often worked late, leaving Zara to manage her homework and household responsibilities independently. This arrangement suited Zara perfectly. She thrived in the quiet house where she could complete her assignments without distraction, and where the only sounds were the gentle hum of the air conditioning and the occasional car passing on Maple Street. Zara's home workstation was set up at the kitchen table, where she could spread out her books and papers while maintaining a view of the front yard. Her organizational system was meticulous. Color-coded folders for each subject, a planner where she tracked every assignment weeks in advance, and a small bulletin board where she posted her academic goals and her father's most recent letters. Staff Sergeant Marcus Williams wrote to his daughter every week, his letters arriving with military punctuality every Thursday afternoon. These letters were Zara's lifeline, filled with encouragement, wisdom, and reminders of the values he had instilled in her throughout her childhood. He wrote about discipline, integrity, and the importance of standing up for what was right, though Zara sometimes wondered how these principles applied to the complex social dynamics of high school life. In his most recent letter, dated 3 weeks earlier, Staff Sergeant Williams had written about courage. "Courage isn't the absence of fear, Zara," he had explained in his careful handwriting. "It's doing what's right, even when you're afraid. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is be yourself, even when the world tells you to be someone else." Zara had read this letter dozens of times, memorizing every word while struggling to understand how to apply his advice to her daily reality. The Williams family's evening routine included a video call with Staff Sergeant Williams whenever his duty schedule and the time difference allowed. These conversations were precious to Zara, though she had become skilled at editing her daily experiences to avoid worrying her father. She would tell him about her grades, her academic achievements, and her mother's work at the medical center, but she never mentioned the loneliness or the careful strategies she employed to avoid social conflict. Dr. Williams, despite her demanding career, made it a priority to check in with her daughter every evening. These conversations usually occurred while Dr. Williams prepared for the next day's appointments, her medical bag spread across the kitchen counter as she organized medications and reviewed patient files. She would ask about Zara's classes, her homework, and her general well-being, But like her husband, she received a carefully curated version of her daughter's high school experience. The truth was that Zara had become expert at managing other people's perceptions of her life. To her parents, she was a successful student who was simply focused on academics rather than social activities. To her teachers, she was a diligent pupil who preferred individual work to group projects. To her classmates, she was virtually invisible, which was exactly how she preferred it. This invisibility came at a cost that Zara was only beginning to understand. At 17, she had never been to a school dance, never attended a football game, never been invited to a birthday party or a sleepover. She told herself these experiences didn't matter, that her focus on academics was preparing her for a successful college career, and the kind of future her parents had sacrificed to provide for her. But sometimes, late at night when the house was quiet and her homework was finished, Zara would lie in bed and wonder what it would feel like to have friends, to be included, to matter to someone her own age. These thoughts were quickly suppressed, pushed down beneath the practical considerations of maintaining her grades and avoiding the kind of social complications that could disrupt the careful balance she had achieved. What Zara didn't know was that her careful invisibility was about to be shattered by forces beyond her control, and that the very qualities she had spent 2 years hiding, her strength, her intelligence, and her connection to a family legacy of service and honor, were about to become the most important weapons in a battle she never wanted to fight. The first crack in Zara's carefully constructed invisibility appeared on a cold Monday morning in February when Jackson Reed decided she was taking up too much space in the hallway. Jackson was Riverside High's golden boy, quarterback of the football team, student body vice president, and the kind of effortlessly popular student who seemed to glide through high school without ever facing real consequences for his actions. Standing 6 feet 3 inches with perfectly styled brown hair and the confident posture of someone who had never been told no, Jackson commanded attention wherever he went. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. His inner circle reflected the social hierarchy of Riverside High with mathematical precision. Mason Clark, the star wide receiver, served as Jackson's primary enforcer, a role he embraced with the enthusiasm of someone who had found his calling in intimidation. Shorter than Jackson but built like a linebacker, Mason compensated for his lack of natural charisma with an aggressive personality that made other students step aside when he approached. Completing the trio was Dylan Foster, whose family owned the largest construction company in Cedar Falls. Dylan's contribution to the group wasn't athletic ability but financial leverage. His father employed half the parents in town, which gave Dylan a unique form of social immunity. Smart enough to stay out of direct confrontations but calculating enough to orchestrate them, Dylan possessed the kind of strategic mind that made him dangerous in ways that weren't immediately obvious. The incident that would change everything started with something as mundane as a dropped textbook. Zara was walking between classes, her usual route carefully planned to avoid the main corridors where the popular students congregated, when her AP chemistry book slipped from her overloaded backpack. The heavy textbook hit the floor with a resounding thud that echoed through the hallway, causing several students to turn and look. Under normal circumstances, this would have been a minor embarrassment that Zara could have quickly resolved by picking up her book and continuing to class. But Jackson Reed happened to be walking past at that exact moment, engaged in an animated conversation with Mason about their weekend plans. The falling book interrupted his story about a party at Dylan's house, and for the first time in 2 years, Jackson Reed actually noticed Zara Williams. "Watch where you're going," Jackson said, his voice carrying the casual authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. He didn't stop walking, didn't help her pick up the book, but his words carried enough volume to ensure that everyone in the vicinity heard them. Zara quickly gathered her textbook and hurried to class, her cheeks burning with embarrassment. She told herself it was nothing, just a random comment that would be forgotten by lunchtime. But she had underestimated the social dynamics at Riverside High, where even small incidents could become ammunition for those looking to establish their dominance. During lunch that day, as Zara sat at her usual table near the windows, she noticed Jackson and his friends talking and occasionally glancing in her direction. Their conversation seemed animated, punctuated by laughter that carried across the cafeteria. Zara tried to ignore them, focusing on the sandwich her mother had prepared and the novel she was reading, but she could feel their attention like a weight on her shoulders. The real shift began the following Wednesday during third period English class. Mrs. Henderson had assigned group presentations on American literature, and students were randomly paired for the project. Through sheer bad luck, Zara found herself partnered with Brittany Wells, one of the cheerleaders who orbited Jackson's social circle like a satellite around the sun. Brittany Wells represented everything that Riverside High valued in its female students: blonde, athletic, socially connected, and blessed with the kind of effortless confidence that came from never having to question her place in the world. Brittany had been homecoming princess the previous year and was already being talked about as a shoo-in for prom queen. Her family owned the town's most successful real estate agency, and her mother served on the school board, giving Brittany a level of institutional protection that most students could only dream about. When Mrs. Henderson announced the partnerships, Brittany's face fell in a way that was visible to half the classroom. She glanced over at Zara with the kind of expression usually reserved for unpleasant medical procedures, then immediately raised her hand to ask if partnerships could be changed. Mrs. Henderson, who had taught long enough to recognize social maneuvering when she saw it, politely but firmly declined the request. "I'm sure you'll both do excellent work together," Mrs. Henderson said, with the kind of forced optimism that teachers used when they knew they were asking students to step outside their comfort zones. "The assignment is due in 2 weeks, so I suggest you use your time wisely." After class, Brittany approached Zara with the demeanor of someone fulfilling an unpleasant obligation. "Look," she said, not bothering to lower her voice despite the students walking past them in the hallway. "I don't have time to babysit anyone through this project. Can you just handle the research, and I'll do the presentation? I'm obviously better at public speaking." Zara felt a familiar surge of anger that she immediately pushed down. She had learned years ago that responding to insults only escalated situations that were better left alone. "I can handle my share of the work," she replied quietly, gathering her books and preparing to leave. "Your share?" Brittany laughed, the sound carrying enough volume to attract attention from nearby students. "Honey, your share is making sure I don't fail this class because I got stuck with—" She paused, apparently searching for the right words. "With someone who doesn't understand how things work around here." The comment hit Zara like a physical blow, but not because of its cruelty. What stung was the casual assumption that she was somehow lesser, somehow incapable of contributing to a simple English project. Zara had been earning A's in advanced placement courses since she arrived at Riverside, but none of that mattered to Brittany Wells, who saw only what she wanted to see. Word of the exchange spread through the school's social networks with the speed that only high school gossip could achieve. By the end of the day, the story had been embellished and distorted until it bore little resemblance to the actual conversation. According to the versions circulating among Jackson's friends, Zara had been rude and difficult, refusing to do her fair share of the work and forcing Brittany to carry the entire project alone. Jackson, who thrived on the kind of drama that reinforced his position as the school's unofficial authority figure, seized on the story as an opportunity to demonstrate his leadership. During football practice that afternoon, he regaled his teammates with an exaggerated account of Zara's supposed behavior, painting her as an ungrateful scholarship student who thought she was too good to work with her betters. The characterization was entirely fictional. Zara wasn't on any kind of scholarship, and her academic performance was significantly better than most of the students Jackson considered his equals. But truth was less important than narrative in the social ecosystem of Riverside High, and Jackson's version of events served a purpose that facts could not. It gave him and his friends a justification for the campaign they were already planning, a way to frame their actions as justice rather than bullying. Mason Clark, whose family had lived in Cedar Falls for 4 generations, added his own inflammatory details to the story. According to Mason, students like Zara were part of a larger problem at Riverside High, outsiders who came to their school and disrupted the natural order of things. His grandfather had attended Riverside High, his father had been captain of the football team, and Mason saw himself as carrying on a family tradition of leadership that newcomers like Zara threatened simply by existing. Dylan Foster, as usual, approached the situation from a more calculated angle. His interest wasn't in Zara herself, but in what targeting her could accomplish for the group's social standing. Dylan understood that successful bullying campaigns required more than just random cruelty. They needed to reinforce existing power structures while providing entertainment for the broader student body. Zara, with her academic success and her obvious efforts to avoid confrontation, represented the perfect target for a campaign that would demonstrate their group's authority. while minimizing the risk of serious consequences. The first real escalation came during lunch on Friday. Zara was sitting at her usual table, reading while she ate, when Jackson and his friends approached with the kind of casual confidence that suggested they had planned this encounter in advance. Other students in the cafeteria sensed the shift in atmosphere and began paying attention, conversations quieting as everyone waited to see what would happen next. "Hey, Zara," Jackson said, his voice carrying the false friendliness that experienced bullies use to mask their intentions. "Brittany tells me you're having some trouble with your English project. That's too bad. I thought you were supposed to be one of the smart ones." Zara looked up from her book, immediately recognizing the trap being set for her. If she defended herself, she would be drawn into a public confrontation that could only end badly. If she remained silent, her lack of response would be interpreted as confirmation of whatever story Jackson wanted to tell. Either way, she was being maneuvered into a losing position by someone who had far more experience with this kind of social warfare. "The project is going fine," Zara replied, keeping her voice level and returning her attention to her book. She hoped that showing disinterest would cause Jackson to lose interest as well, but she had underestimated his commitment to the performance he was putting on for his audience. "Fine," Mason interjected, his voice loud enough to carry across half the cafeteria. "That's not what Brittany says. She says you're being difficult, not doing your share of the work. That's not very fair to her, is it?" Around them, students were openly staring now, some holding up phones to record what was clearly developing into the kind of confrontation that would be shared across social media within hours. Zara could feel her carefully constructed invisibility crumbling, but she still held on to the hope that she could de-escalate the situation without giving Jackson the dramatic reaction he was obviously seeking. "There's been a misunderstanding," Zara said, closing her book and preparing to leave. "I should probably get to class." "A misunderstanding?" Dylan's voice carried a mocking tone that was designed to provoke. "Or maybe you just don't like working with people who've actually earned their place at this school." The implication was clear, and it hit Zara with the force of a physical blow. She had never claimed to deserve anything at Riverside High beyond what her academic performance had earned her. She had never sought special treatment, never demanded inclusion in social circles that didn't want her, never done anything except try to complete her education without causing problems for anyone. But in that moment, Zara realized that her strategy of invisibility had been doomed from the start. To students like Jackson, Dylan, and Mason, her very presence at Riverside High was a challenge to their authority. Her academic success was an implicit criticism of their own mediocrity. Her quiet dignity was an affront to their belief that respect should be distributed based on popularity rather than merit. "I think there's been enough misunderstanding," Zara said, standing up from her table with as much composure as she could muster. She gathered her belongings quickly, but Jackson wasn't finished with his performance. "Running away?" he called out as she walked toward the cafeteria exit. "That's probably for the best. Some people just aren't cut out for Riverside High." The laughter that followed Zara out of the cafeteria would echo in her ears for the rest of the day. But more than the embarrassment, what stayed with her was the realization that her 2 years of careful invisibility had been an illusion. She had never been safe at Riverside High. She had simply been beneath notice. Now that Jackson Reed had decided to pay attention to her, that safety was gone forever. That evening, as Zara sat at her kitchen table trying to focus on her homework, she found herself thinking about her father's letters about courage and standing up for what was right. For the first time, she began to wonder whether her strategy of avoidance had been wisdom or cowardice, and whether the price of peace was worth paying if it meant allowing people like Jackson Reed to define her worth. The weekend after the cafeteria incident provided no respite for Zara, as the harassment had evolved beyond the physical boundaries of Riverside High School. Social media became the new battlefield, where Jackson and his friends could torment her 24 hours a day without direct confrontation or adult supervision. Screenshots of Zara eating alone in the cafeteria appeared on Instagram with cruel captions, while group chats buzzed with increasingly creative ways to make her life miserable. Brittany Wells proved to be a particularly effective weapon in this digital campaign. Her Instagram account, which boasted over 800 followers from Riverside High and neighboring schools, became a platform for subtle but devastating attacks on Zara's character. Posts about people who don't know their place and fake smart kids who think they're better than everyone appeared regularly, always carefully worded to avoid direct mentions that could get her in trouble with school administrators. The psychological warfare extended to seemingly innocent interactions that carried hidden messages. When Zara walked past Jackson's locker on Monday morning, she found him having an animated conversation with Mason about scholarship kids who don't appreciate what they've been given. The conversation was obviously performed for her benefit, designed to reinforce the false narrative that she was somehow receiving special treatment at Riverside High. During second-period government class, Mr. Peterson assigned a current events presentation where students would discuss recent military operations overseas. When Zara volunteered to present on the situation in Afghanistan, Dylan Foster loudly questioned whether she had personal connections to military families that gave her unfair advantages in researching the topic. The suggestion was subtle enough to avoid direct accusation, but clear enough to plant seeds of doubt about Zara's academic integrity. The campaign escalated during lunch periods, where Jackson's group had perfected the art of psychological intimidation without crossing lines that would attract administrative attention. They would choose tables near Zara's usual spot, then engage in conversations clearly designed for her to overhear. Discussions about people who don't belong and outsiders who disrupt school traditions became regular features of their lunch entertainment. Mason Clark proved particularly skilled at this form of harassment, drawing on his family's long history in Cedar Falls to make pointed comments about newcomers who don't understand how things work in our community. His grandfather had served on the town council for 20 years. His father coached Little League baseball, and Mason positioned himself as a defender of local values against outside influences. The isolation tactics were perhaps more devastating than the direct confrontations. Other students, recognizing that Jackson's group had marked Zara as a target, began avoiding her to protect themselves from similar treatment. Lab partners in chemistry class requested transfers, study group invitations dried up, and even teachers seemed less inclined to call on her during class discussions. Kevin Chen, who had been Zara's most consistent academic ally, found himself pressured to distance himself from her. During a particularly cruel incident in AP chemistry, Mason and Dylan cornered Kevin after class and suggested that his association with Zara might impact his chances of getting recommendation letters from teachers who valued, quote, school spirit and social integration. The psychological pressure intensified when Jackson and his friends began targeting Zara's academic achievements directly. They started a whisper campaign suggesting that her high grades resulted from preferential treatment rather than hard work. Anonymous comments appeared on the school's online grade portal questioning whether certain students received special consideration from teachers, while study materials mysteriously disappeared from her locker between classes. The harassment took on increasingly sophisticated forms as Dylan Foster applied his strategic intelligence to the campaign. He researched Zara's class schedule and identified vulnerable moments when she would be isolated or particularly exposed to humiliation. The hallway between third and fourth period became a gauntlet where one of Jackson's friends would invariably be waiting with some form of subtle torment. Physical intimidation escalated gradually, always staying just below the threshold that would trigger administrative intervention. Books would be accidentally knocked from Zara's hands, requiring her to gather scattered papers while other students walked around her. Locker doors would slam shut just as she approached, forcing her to wait while Jackson or his friends finished their obviously prolonged conversations directly in front of her combination lock. The bathroom became another venue for psychological warfare. Brittany Wells and her cheerleader friends would time their visits to coincide with Zara's, then engage in loud conversations about people who think they're too good to participate in school activities, or students who don't contribute to school spirit. The comments were never direct enough to constitute clear harassment, but their intent was unmistakable. Technology provided new avenues for torment as the campaign moved into its third week. Group texts would circulate during classes with Zara's name attached to embarrassing fictional scenarios. Photos of her eating alone or walking by herself would appear in private social media groups with mocking captions that questioned everything from her fashion choices to her family background. The emotional toll of the constant harassment began affecting Zara's academic performance for the first time in her high school career. Her concentration suffered during exams as she found herself scanning the room for potential threats rather than focusing on test questions. Homework assignments that once took her an hour to complete stretched into multi-hour ordeals as anxiety made it impossible to maintain her usual focus. Sleep became elusive as Zara's mind raced through potential scenarios for the next day's harassment. She would lie awake planning alternative routes to classes, rehearsing responses to anticipated confrontations, and developing strategies to minimize her exposure to Jackson's group. The military discipline her father had taught her became a survival mechanism rather than a path to achievement. Dr. Williams began noticing changes in her daughter's behavior, but attributed them to normal teenage stress and the challenges of her father's deployment. When Zara's appetite decreased, and her usual enthusiasm for discussing academics faded, her mother assumed she was struggling with the loneliness of having her father overseas. The truth was that Zara had become expert at hiding her emotional state, protecting her mother from worries that would only add to her stress as a single parent managing a demanding medical practice. The harassment campaign reached a new level of sophistication when Dylan Foster discovered that Zara's mother worked at Cedar Falls Medical Center. He began spreading rumors about special treatment that military families received from local institutions, suggesting that the Williams family benefited from preferential policies that other residents didn't enjoy. The rumors were entirely false, but they served Dylan's purpose of isolating Zara by creating resentment among students whose families had lived in Cedar Falls for generations. Jackson Reed, emboldened by the success of the psychological campaign, began testing the boundaries of what he could accomplish through direct confrontation. During passing periods, he would position himself in Zara's path and then act surprised when she tried to walk around him. "Excuse me," he would say loudly. "I didn't see you there. You're so quiet, sometimes it's like you're invisible." The comment about invisibility was particularly cruel because it highlighted the failure of Zara's primary survival strategy. She had spent 2 years perfecting the art of blending into the background, only to discover that her efforts had been noticed and were now being used against her. Jackson had identified her greatest fear, being seen, and weaponized it for his entertainment. Mason Clark contributed his own brand of intimidation through physical presence and implied threats. Standing over 6 feet tall and weighing nearly 200 pounds, Mason would position himself uncomfortably close to Zara during hallway encounters, using his size to create a sense of menace without actually making physical contact. His favorite tactic was blocking her path to her locker and then taking his time moving aside, forcing her to ask permission to access her own belongings. The most insidious aspect of the campaign was how it recruited bystanders into the harassment through social pressure and entertainment value. Students who had never shown any particular animosity toward Zara began participating in the targeting because it provided social benefits and protection from becoming targets themselves. Laughing at Jackson's jokes, sharing in the group's mockery, and contributing to Zara's isolation became forms of social insurance for students who feared becoming outcasts themselves. Brittany Wells orchestrated the female participation in the campaign with particular effectiveness. She recruited other cheerleaders and popular girls to participate in subtle forms of exclusion and mockery that were harder for teachers to identify, but equally devastating for the victim. Conversations would stop when Zara approached, then resume with obvious glances in her direction. Invitations to group activities would be discussed loudly enough for her to hear, but pointedly not extended to include her. The cumulative effect of weeks of constant harassment began wearing down Zara's emotional reserves in ways that surprised her with their intensity. She had always prided herself on mental toughness, drawing strength from her father's military teachings about perseverance and resilience. But the relentless nature of the campaign, the way it followed her everywhere and infiltrated every aspect of her school experience, created a level of stress that her coping mechanisms couldn't handle. By the 4th week of the campaign, Zara found herself dreading school with an intensity that shocked her. The building that had once represented opportunity and academic achievement now felt like a battlefield where she was constantly under attack. Simple activities like walking to class or eating lunch became exercises in anxiety management as she tried to anticipate and prepare for the next form of harassment. The isolation was perhaps the most devastating aspect of the entire campaign. Zara had always been comfortable with solitude, but being alone by choice was entirely different from being alone because no one wanted to associate with you. The knowledge that other students were avoiding her to protect themselves created a level of loneliness that cut deeper than any direct insult or physical intimidation. What Zara didn't know was that her suffering was being documented in ways she couldn't imagine. Security cameras throughout Riverside High were recording every incident, every harassment, every moment of her humiliation. And thousands of miles away, Staff Sergeant Marcus Williams was receiving detailed reports about his daughter's situation from sources she had never suspected existed. The storm that was building would soon make Jackson Reed's campaign look like a gentle rain compared to the hurricane that was approaching Cedar Falls, Georgia. The morning of March 15th began like any other day at Riverside High, but the undercurrents of tension had been building to a crescendo that would forever change the lives of everyone involved. Zara Williams sat in her first period AP literature class, trying to focus on Mrs. Henderson's discussion of courage in American literature, unaware that this particular theme would become devastatingly relevant to her own life within hours. Jackson Reed had spent the weekend planning what he considered his masterpiece of psychological warfare. The constant harassment over the past month had been successful in isolating Zara and demonstrating his power, but Jackson craved something more dramatic, more public, more permanently humiliating. He wanted an incident that would be talked about for years, something that would cement his reputation as someone who could destroy anyone who challenged the social order at Riverside High. The plan had been conceived during a sleepover at Dylan Foster's house, where the three friends had spent hours crafting what they believed would be the perfect culmination of their campaign. Dylan's strategic mind had identified the school's spring sports banquet as the ideal setting, an event where the entire school community would be present, including parents, teachers, and local media, covering the athletic achievements of Riverside High's most prominent students. But Mason Clark had suggested an even more immediate and devastating venue, the regular lunch period on a day when the cafeteria would be packed with students, and the new security cameras would capture everything for posterity. The irony of using the school's own surveillance system to document their triumph appealed to their teenage sense of invincibility and drama. The morning progressed with ominous normalcy as Zara navigated her classes, unaware of the trap being carefully constructed around her. In second period chemistry, she completed a lab experiment on molecular bonding with her usual precision, earning a nod of approval from Mr. Davidson, who had become one of her few remaining allies among the faculty. The small gesture of academic recognition felt precious to Zara, who had grown hungry for any form of positive acknowledgement in her increasingly hostile environment. During third period government class, the tension began building in ways that Zara could sense but not fully understand. Jackson, Mason, and Dylan were unusually animated, exchanging glances and barely suppressed grins that suggested they were anticipating something exciting. Other students seemed to pick up on the energy, creating an atmosphere of expectation that made Zara increasingly uncomfortable. The plan they had developed was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its potential impact. Jackson would approach Zara during lunch with what appeared to be a peace offering, an invitation to join his table and become part of the popular crowd. When she inevitably declined, as her past behavior suggested she would, Mason would escalate the situation by questioning her gratitude and respect for the social hierarchy of Riverside High. The crucial element was Dylan's contribution. He had prepared a special welcome gift for Zara in the form of a lunch tray loaded with the cafeteria's messiest offerings: spaghetti with meat sauce, chocolate pudding, fruit punch, and a side of coleslaw that would create maximum visual impact when deployed. The plan was to accidentally spill the contents on Zara during the confrontation, creating a humiliating spectacle that would be impossible to ignore or forget. But the three friends had made a critical miscalculation in their assessment of their target. They had observed Zara's quiet demeanor and interpreted it as weakness, her academic focus as social inadequacy, and her desire for peace as inability to defend herself. They had no understanding of the military values that had shaped her character or the strength she had inherited from a family tradition of service and sacrifice. As the lunch period began, Zara made her way to the cafeteria with the same careful routine she had followed for weeks. She purchased her usual turkey sandwich and apple, filled her water bottle at the fountain, and walked toward her customary table near the windows. The cafeteria was unusually crowded that day, with several classes having been dismissed early for a faculty meeting that had freed up more students than usual. Jackson Reed had positioned himself strategically near the entrance, flanked by Mason and Dylan in a formation that looked casual but had been carefully rehearsed. As Zara passed their location, Jackson stepped forward with an expression of exaggerated friendliness that immediately put her on guard. "Zara!" Jackson called out, his voice loud enough to attract attention from nearby tables. "Perfect timing. We've been talking, and we think maybe we got off on the wrong foot. What do you say we start over?" The offer was so obviously false that Zara almost laughed, but she recognized the trap being set for her. Jackson's tone was warm and inviting, but his eyes held the cold calculation of a predator moving in for the kill. Mason and Dylan flanked him with barely concealed anticipation, while students throughout the cafeteria began turning to watch the developing drama. "I'm fine where I am, thank you," Zara replied politely, attempting to continue toward her table. But Mason stepped slightly to his left, creating a human barrier that forced her to stop. "Come on," Mason said with false joviality. "Don't be antisocial. Jackson's trying to be friendly here. The least you could do is hear him out." Around them, conversations had died as students recognized that something significant was happening. Phones appeared discreetly, positioned to record whatever was about to unfold. The cafeteria staff, busy with the lunch rush, remained unaware of the tension building in their domain. "Look," Jackson continued, moving closer to Zara in a way that used his height advantage to create physical intimidation. "I know we've had our differences, but that's just because you haven't given us a chance to get to know you. Why don't you come sit with us? We could be friends." The word "friends" was delivered with such obvious insincerity that several students in the immediate vicinity exchanged glances. But Jackson's performance wasn't intended to convince anyone of his genuine desire for friendship. It was designed to create a public record of his attempt at reconciliation, making Zara's inevitable rejection appear ungrateful and antisocial. "I appreciate the offer," Zara said carefully, "but I prefer to eat alone. I have studying to do." Dylan Foster seized on her response with the timing of a practiced debater. "Studying," he said loud enough for half the cafeteria to hear. "Always with studying. Don't you think there's more to high school than just books? What about school spirit? What about being part of the community?" The questions were loaded with implications that weren't lost on the growing audience. Dylan was positioning Zara's academic focus as selfishness, her quiet demeanor as arrogance, and her desire for solitude as rejection of the school community. It was a masterful piece of manipulation that turned her strengths into apparent weaknesses. "I participate in the community in my own way," Zara replied, feeling the conversation spiraling toward a confrontation she desperately wanted to avoid. "Not everyone shows school spirit the same way." Mason stepped closer, his considerable bulk now directly in front of Zara's path to her table. "What's that supposed to mean?" he demanded. "Are you saying there's something wrong with how we show school spirit? Are you too good for the way things work around here?" The accusation hung in the air like a challenge, and Zara could feel the weight of dozens of eyes upon her. She understood that she was being maneuvered into a position where any response would be used against her. But she also recognized that remaining silent would be interpreted as confirmation of the charges being leveled against her character. "I'm not too good for anything," Zara said, her voice carrying a strength that surprised even her. "I just want to eat my lunch in peace. Is that really too much to ask?" Jackson's mask of friendliness finally slipped, revealing the cold anger that had been driving his campaign against her. "Peace?" he said with a laugh that carried no humor. "You think you deserve peace. You come to our school, act like you're better than everyone, refuse every attempt at friendship, and then demand to be left alone?" The confrontation had reached the point Jackson had been steering toward from the beginning. He gestured to Dylan, who moved toward the lunch line where he had strategically positioned a tray loaded with the messiest items the cafeteria had to offer. The plan was to create a, quote, accidental collision that would drench Zara in food, providing the humiliating climax their campaign had been building toward. But as Dylan approached with the loaded tray, something unexpected happened. Zara's training kicked in. Not just the academic discipline her parents had instilled in her, but the deeper lessons about situational awareness and threat assessment that came from growing up in a military family. She saw Dylan's approach, recognized the positioning of the tray, and understood exactly what was about to happen. For the first time in months of harassment, Zara Williams made a conscious decision to stop being a victim. "You want to know what I think?" Zara said, her voice cutting through the cafeteria noise with a clarity that made conversations stop at tables throughout the room. "I think you three are cowards." The word cowards feel like a bomb in the sudden silence. Jackson's face flushed red with anger and embarrassment while Mason took an aggressive step forward. Dylan, still carrying his loaded tray, froze in confusion as the script he had been following suddenly changed. "What did you just say?" Jackson demanded, his voice rising to a level that guaranteed the entire cafeteria would hear every word of what followed. Zara looked around the crowded room, seeing hundreds of students watching this confrontation unfold. For weeks, she had endured their harassment in relative privacy, suffering their attacks while trying to maintain her dignity and avoid escalation. But standing here now, facing their public challenge in front of the entire school community, she made a decision that would change everything. "I said you're cowards," Zara repeated, her voice steady and clear. Three big, strong football players who spend their time terrorizing one quiet girl because it makes them feel powerful. What would you call that? The cafeteria had fallen completely silent now, hundreds of students straining to hear every word of this unprecedented confrontation. Teachers monitoring the lunch period began moving closer, sensing that something significant was happening, but not yet understanding the full scope of the situation. Jackson's face had gone from red to purple, his carefully constructed image of controlled leadership crumbling in the face of Zara's direct challenge. "You have no idea who you're messing with," he said, his voice carrying a threat that was heard by everyone present. "Actually," Zara replied, her military bearing now fully evident in her posture and tone, "I know exactly who I'm dealing with. Bullies who pick on people they think can't fight back. Cowards who travel in packs because they're too weak to handle anything alone. Children who think popularity gives them the right to make other people miserable." Dylan, still holding his loaded tray, made his move towards Zara with the intention of carrying out their planned humiliation. But Zara had been watching him from the corner of her eye, and when he stepped forward with obvious hostile intent, she reacted with the reflexes her father had trained into her since childhood. She stepped aside smoothly, letting Dylan's momentum carry him past her, then placed her foot in exactly the right position to send him stumbling forward. The loaded tray flew from his hands, its contents splattering across the floor in a spectacular mess that drew gasps from the watching students. Dylan himself crashed to his knees in the middle of the spilled food, his white polo shirt now decorated with spaghetti sauce and chocolate pudding. The reversal was so complete and so sudden that the cafeteria erupted in shocked laughter and applause. Dylan Foster, who had planned to humiliate Zara Williams, instead found himself covered in food while she stood over him with the calm dignity of someone who had just demonstrated that she was not, and had never been, helpless. "Like I said," Zara announced to the silent cafeteria, her voice carrying to every corner of the room, "Cowards." What none of them knew was that every moment of this confrontation had been captured in high-definition video by the school's security system, and that thousands of miles away, a decorated Marine was watching his daughter defend herself with the pride and fury of a father who was about to take action. The aftermath of the cafeteria incident rippled through Riverside High School like an earthquake, but the real shock was yet to come. While students spent the remainder of that day buzzing about Zara Williams' unexpected display of strength and Dylan Foster's humiliating defeat, none of them realized that their actions had attracted the attention of someone far more formidable than any high school administrator. 3,000 miles away at Forward Operating Base Kandahar, Staff Sergeant Marcus Williams had been reviewing security footage from his daughter's school through channels that most civilians didn't know existed. Military families serving overseas had access to certain protective measures that were rarely discussed but frequently utilized when threats to service members' families were identified. The Marine Corps took care of its own, and when a decorated staff sergeant requested surveillance assistance to monitor his daughter's safety, that request carried significant weight. For 2 weeks, Marcus had been watching the systematic harassment of his child through high-definition security cameras, his jaw tightening with each incident of bullying he witnessed. The footage was compiled and transmitted to him through secure military communication networks via contact at the Department of Defense who specialized in domestic security matters. What Marcus saw in those recordings transformed a concerned father into a tactical problem that required immediate resolution. The morning after the cafeteria confrontation, Principal Sandra Morrison received a phone call that would change everything. The voice on the other end of the line was calm, professional, and carried the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Principal Morrison, this is Staff Sergeant Marcus Williams, United States Marine Corps. I'm calling regarding my daughter Zara Williams, and I need to schedule an immediate meeting to discuss some serious concerns about her treatment at your school." Principal Morrison, who had been expecting a routine parent complaint about yesterday's cafeteria incident, was unprepared for the military precision in Staff Sergeant Williams' voice. "Of course, Mr. Williams. I understand there was some conflict yesterday, but I can assure you that we're handling the situation appropriately. Ma'am, Marcus replied, his tone remaining respectful but carrying an edge that made Principal Morrison sit up straighter in her chair. With all due respect, I don't think you fully understand the situation. I'll be arriving at your school tomorrow morning at 0800 hours. I suggest you have Jackson Reed, Mason Clark, Dylan Foster, and their parents present for this meeting. The line went dead, leaving Principal Morrison staring at her phone with growing dread. In 23 years of educational administration, she had dealt with angry parents, district officials, and state inspectors, but something in Staff Sergeant Williams' voice suggested that this meeting would be unlike anything in her experience. That evening, Zara was surprised when her mother announced that her father would be arriving home unexpectedly the next morning. Dr. Williams had received her own phone call from Marcus, though the details she shared with Zara were carefully edited to avoid revealing the full scope of what was about to unfold. Your father received emergency leave to handle some family matters, Dr. Williams explained, her medical training helping her maintain a calm demeanor despite her own concerns about what Marcus had planned. He'll be here tomorrow morning and wants to visit your school to check on how things are going. Zara felt a complex mixture of emotions at this news. Part of her was thrilled at the prospect of seeing her father after months of deployment, but another part worried about what his sudden appearance might mean for her carefully maintained independence. She had worked hard to handle the bullying situation without burdening her parents, and she feared that her father's involvement might somehow make things worse. What Zara didn't know was that Marcus Williams had spent the past 48 hours coordinating with military and civilian authorities to ensure that his intervention would be both legal and devastatingly effective. Phone calls had been made to the school district's central office, the local police department, and even the mayor's office, laying groundwork for a confrontation that would send reverberations throughout the entire Cedar Falls community. The next morning arrived with the crisp clarity of a Georgia spring day, but the atmosphere at Riverside High School was electric with tension. Word had somehow spread that something significant was going to happen, though the details remained mysterious. Students gathered in clusters, sharing rumors and speculation about the mysterious meeting that had been scheduled for the first period. Jackson Reed, Mason Clark, and Dylan Foster had been pulled from their first period classes and instructed to report to the principal's office, along with their parents who had received urgent phone calls the previous evening. The three boys sat in the main office waiting area, their usual confidence replaced by growing anxiety as they tried to understand what was happening. Jackson's father, Robert Reed, was a successful insurance agent who had spent years leveraging his son's athletic achievements for social and business advantages. He entered the school building with the swagger of someone accustomed to having influence in the community, but his confidence began to waver when he saw the other parents' nervous expressions. Mason's mother, Patricia Clark, came directly from her job at the bank, where she served as a loan officer. Her family's multi-generational presence in Cedar Falls had always provided social protection for Mason's behavior, but she was beginning to sense that their local connections might not be sufficient for whatever was about to unfold. Dylan's parents, construction magnate William Foster and his wife Jennifer, arrived in their luxury SUV with the assumption that their economic influence would quickly resolve whatever minor school incident had triggered this meeting. William Foster had donated significant money to Riverside High's athletic programs and expected that investment to provide his family with certain privileges and protections. Principal Morrison had spent the previous evening researching Staff Sergeant Marcus Williams and discovered credentials that made her increasingly nervous about the morning's meeting. Multiple combat deployments, commendations for leadership under fire, specialized training in military police operations, and a service record that commanded respect from anyone familiar with military culture. At exactly 8 o'clock, a figure appeared in the school's main entrance that immediately commanded attention from everyone present. Staff Sergeant Marcus Williams stood 6 feet 4 inches tall, his marine dress blue uniform immaculate despite his overnight flight from Germany. His bearing was that of a man accustomed to command, his movements precise and purposeful, his eyes scanning the environment with the tactical awareness of someone trained to assess threats and neutralize them. The effect of his appearance on the assembled group was immediate and profound. The three boys who had spent months terrorizing his daughter suddenly understood that they were about to face consequences far beyond anything their previous experience had prepared them for. Their parents, who had entered the building expecting to manage a minor disciplinary issue, realized they were confronting a situation entirely outside their control. "Principal Morrison," Marcus said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to life-and-death responsibility. "I'm Staff Sergeant Williams. Thank you for arranging this meeting on short notice." Principal Morrison stood to shake his hand, immediately struck by the difference between this man and the typical parents she dealt with in disciplinary situations. "Of course, Staff Sergeant Williams. Please, have a seat and we can discuss whatever concerns you have about yesterday's incident." Marcus remained standing, his posture military perfect as he addressed the room. "Ma'am, this meeting isn't about yesterday's incident. This meeting is about 2 months of systematic harassment, intimidation, and bullying that my daughter has endured while I've been serving my country overseas." The statement fell like a bomb in the conference room. Jackson's father began to protest, but Marcus held up a hand that immediately silenced him. "Sir, I'm going to ask you to remain quiet until I've finished explaining the situation. What I'm about to share with you will require your full attention." Marcus reached into a briefcase and withdrew a tablet computer which he connected to the conference room's presentation system. "For the past month, I've been receiving detailed security footage from this school through official military channels. What I've witnessed has convinced me that immediate action is required to protect my daughter and prevent further incidents." The first video began playing on the conference room screen, showing Jackson's initial confrontation with Zara in the hallway weeks earlier. The high-definition footage captured every word, every gesture, every moment of intimidation, with perfect clarity. Marcus had edited the compilation to show the progression of harassment over time, creating a devastating timeline of systematic bullying. This first incident, Marcus explained in the calm, professional tone he used for military briefings, shows your son, Mr. Reed, initiating contact with my daughter for the purpose of intimidation. Note the body language, the positioning, the deliberate use of height advantage to create physical threat. Robert Reed's face had gone pale as he watched his son's behavior displayed with clinical precision. "Now wait just a minute," he began, but Marcus continued without acknowledging the interruption. "The following footage shows escalation over a period of 6 weeks. Mrs. Clark, your son's behavior pattern indicates training in intimidation tactics, possibly learned through organized athletics but applied for purposes of harassment." The videos continued, each incident documented and analyzed with military precision. The psychological warfare campaign, the isolation tactics, the recruitment of other students into the harassment. Every element of the bullying was laid out like evidence in a court-martial proceeding. William Foster watched his son's strategic contributions to the campaign with growing horror. "This can't be right," he said weakly. "Dylan's never been in trouble before." "Mr. Foster," Marcus replied, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority, "your son has demonstrated sophisticated understanding of psychological warfare techniques. The systematic nature of this campaign suggests planning, coordination, and deliberate intent to cause emotional harm." The final video showed the previous day's cafeteria incident, but from angles that captured details no student observer had seen. The premeditation was obvious, the coordination between the 3 boys clearly visible, and Zara's defensive response appeared entirely justified given the circumstances. "Gentlemen," Marcus said, turning to address the 3 boys directly for the first time, "you made a critical error in your target selection. My daughter is not defenseless. She's the child of a United States Marine, trained from childhood in situational awareness, threat assessment, and appropriate response to hostile action." The boys sat in stunned silence, their earlier bravado completely evaporated. Jackson, who had spent months positioning himself as the dominant force at Riverside High School, now looked like what he truly was, a teenager who had never faced real consequences for his actions. "Furthermore," Marcus continued, "your campaign of harassment has been conducted against the daughter of an active-duty service member, which elevates this situation beyond simple school disciplinary matters. There are federal statutes that address interference with military families, and I'm prepared to pursue those charges if necessary." Principal Morrison, who had been taking notes frantically throughout the presentation, looked up with obvious concern. "Staff Sergeant Williams, I had no idea the situation was this extensive. Our normal monitoring procedures didn't identify this pattern of behavior." "Ma'am," Marcus replied, "respectfully, your monitoring procedures failed to protect my child. That failure has required me to take emergency leave from active duty in a combat zone to personally address threats to my family's safety. That represents a significant escalation that will have consequences beyond this room. The parents of the three boys exchanged desperate glances, recognizing that their children had created a situation far beyond their ability to manage through normal channels. The social and economic influence they had always relied upon meant nothing when confronted with the full authority of the United States military system. "What happens now?" Patricia Clark asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Marcus Williams looked at each person in the room with the steady gaze of someone who had made life-and-death decisions in combat situations. "Now," he said, "we discuss how you're going to ensure that my daughter never faces harassment again, and how you're going to demonstrate that actions have consequences in ways these boys will never forget." The silence in Principal Morrison's conference room stretched for what felt like an eternity, before Staff Sergeant Williams continued his systematic dismantling of the situation that had terrorized his daughter for months. The tablet in his hands contained more than just security footage. It held a comprehensive dossier that would reshape the lives of everyone present. "Before we discuss consequences," Marcus said, his voice maintaining the same military precision that had characterized his entire presentation, "I want each of you to understand the full scope of what has occurred here. This wasn't children being children. This was a coordinated campaign of psychological warfare conducted against a minor child whose father was serving his country in a combat zone." He advanced to the next slide on his presentation, revealing documentation that made several parents visibly pale. Phone records, social media screenshots, and digital evidence painted a picture of harassment that extended far beyond the school grounds and into areas that touched on cyberbullying statutes and federal communications regulations. "Mrs. Foster," Marcus addressed Dylan's mother directly, "your son coordinated much of this campaign through social media platforms and group messaging systems. Under current federal law, the use of interstate communication networks to harass minors carries serious penalties. Dylan's digital footprint shows clear intent to cause emotional distress through systematic targeting." Jennifer Foster clutched her husband's arm, her face reflecting the dawning realization that their son's behavior had crossed lines they hadn't even known existed. William Foster, who had built his construction empire through careful attention to legal details, understood immediately that his family was facing potential federal charges that his local connections couldn't influence. "Mr. Reed," Marcus continued, turning his attention to Jackson's father, "your son's role as the primary orchestrator of this campaign makes him liable under anti-bullying statutes that carry both civil and criminal penalties. His use of his position as student body vice president to facilitate harassment represents an abuse of institutional authority that the school district takes very seriously." Robert Reed's insurance background had made him familiar with liability issues, but nothing in his experience had prepared him for the methodical way Staff Sergeant Williams was documenting his son's exposure to legal consequences. The professional presentation made it clear that this wasn't an angry parent making threats. This was a military officer presenting a tactical assessment backed by legal research and federal resources. "Mrs. Clark," Marcus said, addressing Mason's mother with the same calm authority, "your son's contribution involved physical intimidation and implied threats of violence. Given his size advantage over my daughter and his deliberate use of that advantage to create fear, his actions fall under assault statutes that don't require actual physical contact to constitute criminal behavior." Patricia Clark had worked in banking long enough to recognize when someone had done their homework thoroughly. The documentation Staff Sergeant Williams presented was the kind of comprehensive evidence package that left no room for negotiation or mitigation. Her son hadn't just been bullying another student, he had been committing acts that qualified as criminal harassment under state and federal law. Principal Morrison, who had been frantically taking notes throughout the presentation, finally found her voice. "Staff Sergeant Williams, I need you to know that Riverside High School has zero tolerance for the behavior you've documented. We will be implementing immediate disciplinary measures and reviewing our entire monitoring system to prevent future incidents." Marcus turned his attention to the principal with the same intensity he had shown the parents. "Ma'am, with respect, your zero-tolerance policy failed to protect my daughter for 2 months. The systematic nature of this harassment suggests that your current systems are inadequate to identify and address coordinated bullying campaigns." He clicked to another slide that showed a timeline of incidents alongside school administrative responses. "This documentation shows 17 separate incidents of harassment that should have triggered intervention under your published policies. The failure to identify this pattern represents a systemic problem that extends beyond individual disciplinary actions." The 3 boys, who had remained silent throughout the presentation, now faced the full weight of their choices. as their parents struggled to comprehend the magnitude of the situation they had created. Jackson, who had always been able to rely on his father's influence to smooth over any problems, watched his carefully constructed world crumble as military precision met teenage arrogance. "What do you want from us?" William Foster asked, his voice reflecting the desperation of a successful businessman who had suddenly found himself completely outmaneuvered. "What will it take to resolve this situation?" Marcus Williams set down his tablet and looked at each person in the room with the steady gaze of someone who had commanded Marines in combat situations. "Mr. Foster, this isn't a negotiation. This is a briefing on actions that will be taken to ensure my daughter's safety and to demonstrate that choices have consequences." He opened a folder that contained documents bearing official letterheads from multiple government agencies. "I've already filed formal complaints with the Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights, the Georgia Department of Education, and the local police department. These aren't threats. These are actions already in motion." The parents exchanged panicked glances as they realized that Staff Sergeant Williams hadn't come to negotiate. He had come to announce decisions that had already been made through channels they couldn't influence or control. "Additionally," Marcus continued, "I've requested that the school district conduct a comprehensive review of Riverside High School's anti-bullying policies and implementation procedures. This review will be conducted by external evaluators with expertise in military family issues and federal compliance requirements." Principal Morrison felt her career flashing before her eyes, as she realized that her school was about to undergo the kind of intensive scrutiny that could result in federal oversight and potential loss of funding. "Staff Sergeant Williams, surely we can work together to address these issues without involving federal agencies." "Ma'am," Marcus replied, "the time for internal resolution passed when my daughter was forced to defend herself in your cafeteria because your systems failed to protect her. Federal involvement became necessary when local systems proved inadequate." He turned his attention to the three boys, who had been listening to their futures being dismantled with growing horror. "Jackson, Mason, Dylan, you made a choice to target my daughter because you believed she was vulnerable and alone. You were wrong on both counts." Jackson finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Sir, we didn't know. We never meant for it to go this far." Marcus's expression didn't change, but his voice carried the weight of absolute authority. "Son, ignorance of consequences doesn't eliminate responsibility for actions. In the Marine Corps, we learned that leadership means accepting accountability for everything that happens under your command. You chose to lead a campaign of harassment, and now you'll learn what accountability means." The consequences that Staff Sergeant Williams outlined were swift and comprehensive. Jackson Reed would be removed from his position as student body vice president and suspended from the football team pending a full investigation. His college recruitment prospects, which had been built around his leadership roles, would be severely impacted by the disciplinary actions on his permanent record. Mason Clark faced suspension from all athletic activities and mandatory enrollment in anger management counseling. His family's multi-generational reputation in Cedar Falls would be permanently tarnished by the federal investigation into his conduct, affecting not just his future but his family's standing in the community. Dylan Foster's consequences included expulsion from all extracurricular activities and mandatory community service focused on anti-bullying education. His father's construction company, which depended on school district contracts, would face scrutiny of their compliance with federal diversity and inclusion requirements. But the consequences extended beyond the immediate participants. Brittany Wells and her cheerleader friends faced their own disciplinary actions for their participation in the harassment campaign. The social media evidence that Staff Sergeant Williams had compiled included their contributions to the psychological warfare, making them liable under the same cyberbullying statutes. "The digital evidence we've compiled," Marcus explained, "shows a network of participants that extends beyond these three boys. Every student who contributed to the harassment campaign will face appropriate consequences under school policy and applicable laws." The ripple effects spread throughout Riverside High School's social hierarchy, as students who had participated in or enabled the harassment realized that their actions had been documented and would have consequences. The assumption that popular students were immune from serious discipline evaporated as federal investigators began reviewing the comprehensive evidence package. Principal Morrison announced immediate changes to the school's monitoring and intervention procedures, including enhanced training for staff, improved reporting systems, and partnership with military family support organizations. The changes were designed not just to address the current situation but to prevent future incidents from escalating to federal intervention levels. The local police department launched their own investigation into the harassment campaign, focusing particularly on the cyberbullying aspects that crossed state lines through social media platforms. Detective Sarah Martinez, who specialized in crimes against minors, found the military-compiled evidence to be the most comprehensive package she had ever received for a bullying case. As news of the investigation spread through Cedar Falls, the community began grappling with the reality that their high school's social dynamics had enabled systematic harassment of a military family. Local veterans organizations rallied around the Williams family, while businesses that had previously catered to the popular students' families began reconsidering their associations. The media attention was swift and intense. Local news stations picked up the story of a deployed Marine's intervention in his daughter's bullying case, turning it into a symbol of military family sacrifice and community responsibility. National military family advocacy organizations used the case to highlight the unique challenges faced by children of deployed service members. For Zara Williams, the immediate aftermath brought a complex mixture of relief and anxiety. The harassment that had dominated her life for months was finally over, but the public attention felt overwhelming for someone who had spent years perfecting the art of invisibility. However, the support that emerged from unexpected quarters began showing her a different side of her school community. Students who had remained silent during her harassment began approaching her with apologies and offers of friendship. Teachers who had been unaware of the situation expressed their support and admiration for her resilience. The academic community that she had always found welcoming became even more protective of her achievements and potential. Dr. Angela Williams watched her daughter navigate this new reality with a mixture of pride and concern. As a physician, she understood the psychological impact of prolonged stress, but she also recognized the strength that Zara had developed through her ordeal. The family therapy sessions that Marcus arranged helped all three family members process the experience and plan for a healthier future. The transformation at Riverside High School was immediate and dramatic. The social hierarchy that had enabled the harassment campaign crumbled, as students realized that actions had consequences regardless of popularity or family connections. Teachers became more vigilant about identifying potential bullying situations, while administrators implemented systems designed to prevent coordination of harassment campaigns. Staff Sergeant Williams remained at Riverside High for a full week, his presence serving as a powerful reminder that military families deserved the same protection and respect as any other community members. His daily interactions with students, teachers, and administrators reinforced the message that service to the country created obligations for community support. The legal proceedings that followed would take months to resolve, but the immediate impact was clear. Riverside High School would never again tolerate the kind of systematic harassment that had targeted Zara Williams. The federal oversight that resulted from the investigation ensured that anti-bullying policies would be enforced, with the same precision that Staff Sergeant Williams had brought to documenting his daughter's ordeal. As the first week after the confrontation ended, Zara Williams walked through the halls of Riverside High School with her head held high, knowing that she was no longer alone, no longer invisible, and no longer afraid. The quiet strength that her military family had instilled in her had finally found its voice, and that voice had changed everything. 6 months after Staff Sergeant Marcus Williams arrived at Riverside High School in his dress blues, the ripple effects of his intervention continued to reshape not just the school but the entire Cedar Falls community. What had begun as one father's determination to protect his daughter had evolved into a comprehensive transformation of how the town understood accountability, respect, and the true meaning of supporting military families. Zara Williams stood at her graduation podium as class valedictorian, looking out at an audience that included not just her family but representatives from military family advocacy organizations, school administrators from across the state, and local community leaders who had learned valuable lessons about the cost of looking the other way. Her speech, titled "Finding Your Voice When Others Try to Silence You," would be shared thousands of times on social media and used in anti-bullying presentations across the country. 18 months ago, Zara began, her voice carrying the confidence that had emerged from surviving her ordeal and seeing justice prevail. "I believed that invisibility was safety, that silence was wisdom, and that enduring injustice was somehow noble. I was wrong, on all counts. The transformation in Zara herself was perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the entire story. The quiet, withdrawn student who had spent 2 years hiding in corners had become a powerful advocate for military children and a nationally recognized voice in anti-bullying efforts. Her academic achievements, already impressive, had reached new heights as she channeled her experience into research projects and policy recommendations that caught the attention of educational reformers. The scholarship offers that arrived throughout her senior year reflected not just her academic excellence, but the respect she had earned through her courage under pressure. The Naval Academy, West Point, and several prestigious civilian universities competed for the opportunity to welcome someone who had demonstrated both intellectual ability and personal integrity in the face of systematic adversity. The experience taught me that strength isn't about being the loudest voice in the room, Zara continued, her eyes finding her father in the audience. Sometimes strength is about being quiet until you have something important to say, and then having the courage to say it clearly and without compromise. Staff Sergeant Williams had completed his deployment and accepted a training position at the Marine Corps base in nearby Albany, allowing him to be present for his daughter's senior year while contributing to the education of young Marines. His intervention at Riverside High had become a case study in military family advocacy programs, demonstrating how decisive action could protect service members' children while strengthening civil-military relationships. The legal consequences for Jackson Reed, Mason Clark, and Dylan Foster had been severe but educational. Jackson's college football prospects had evaporated along with his scholarship offers, forcing him to confront a future built on merit rather than athletic privilege. The federal investigation had revealed additional incidents of harassment targeting other students, making him liable for a pattern of behavior that extended far beyond his campaign against Zara. The court-mandated community service that followed had placed Jackson in programs supporting military families, where he worked directly with children whose parents were deployed overseas. The irony wasn't lost on anyone that the boy who had tormented a military child was now helping military families navigate the challenges of deployment and reintegration. I learned that people aren't just bullies or victims, Jackson wrote in a reflection essay required by his probation officer. I learned that my actions had consequences not just for Zara but for her entire family, including her father serving our country. I can't undo what I did, but I can spend the rest of my life making sure other kids don't go through what she experienced. Mason Clark's transformation had been equally dramatic, but followed a different path. The federal investigation had revealed that his harassment of Zara was part of a larger pattern of using his size and family connections to intimidate students he perceived as different or threatening. The psychological evaluation required by the court had diagnosed underlying insecurity and anger issues that had never been addressed. The anger management program and community service had introduced Mason to mentoring programs for at-risk youth, where his own experience with anger and poor choices made him an effective counselor for younger students struggling with similar issues. His family's reputation in Cedar Falls had been permanently altered, but Mason had found purpose in preventing other young people from making the same mistakes. I thought being tough meant making other people afraid of you, Mason reflected during a presentation to incoming freshmen at Riverside High. I learned that real toughness is about protecting people who need help, not targeting people who seem vulnerable. Dylan Foster's consequences had extended beyond personal accountability to impact his family's business empire. The federal investigation into his use of technology for harassment had revealed that Foster Construction's computer systems had been used to coordinate some of the cyberbullying activities. The resulting compliance review had cost the company several major contracts and required implementation of strict digital ethics policies. Dylan himself had become an unexpected expert in cyberbullying prevention. His strategic mind that had once been used for harassment now focused on developing systems to identify and prevent online campaigns before they could cause damage. His mandatory community service had evolved into a consulting business helping schools and organizations recognize the warning signs of coordinated digital harassment. I was good at using technology to hurt people, Dylan admitted during a presentation to school administrators. Now I'm trying to be even better at using technology to protect them. The same skills that made me dangerous as a bully make me effective at stopping other bullies. Brittany Wells and her circle of cheerleaders had faced their own reckoning, as the investigation revealed the crucial role that social exclusion and female-led harassment had played in Zara's isolation. The assumption that girls' aggression was somehow less serious than boys' physical intimidation had been thoroughly debunked by the federal investigation's findings. Brittany's college admissions had been affected by the disciplinary actions on her transcript, forcing her to attend a state university rather than the prestigious private school she had planned to attend. The experience had introduced her to a more diverse student population and academic challenges that revealed intellectual capabilities she had never been encouraged to develop. "I thought popularity was about making other people feel small," Brittany wrote in her college application essay about overcoming adversity. "I learned that real leadership is about making everyone feel valued and included. The hardest lesson was realizing that I had been a follower pretending to be a leader." The transformation at Riverside High School itself had been comprehensive and permanent. Principal Morrison had survived the federal investigation, but only after implementing sweeping changes to every aspect of the school's culture and operations. The monitoring systems that had failed to detect Zara's harassment had been replaced with sophisticated programs that used artificial intelligence to identify patterns of exclusion and targeting before they escalated to crisis levels. The new anti-bullying curriculum included mandatory training on military family issues, recognizing that children of deployed service members faced unique vulnerabilities that required special attention and protection. Guest speakers from military family advocacy organizations became regular features of the school's programming, ensuring that civilian students understood the sacrifices made by military families. "We learned that supporting our troops means supporting their families, especially their children," Principal Morrison explained during a presentation to other school administrators. "We can't claim to honor service members while allowing their children to be harassed in our schools." The faculty training programs had been completely redesigned to help teachers recognize the difference between normal teenage conflict and systematic harassment campaigns. The previous assumption that students would work out their own problems had been replaced with proactive intervention strategies that addressed power imbalances before they could be exploited by potential bullies. Dr. Angela Williams had become a prominent voice in advocating for military families' needs within civilian communities. Her medical expertise combined with her personal experience had made her an effective spokesperson for policy changes that protected service members' children while their parents were deployed. "Military families make sacrifices that extend far beyond the service member," Dr. Williams testified before a congressional subcommittee on military family support. "When we fail to protect military children in our schools, we're asking families to sacrifice their children's well-being along with everything else they give to serve our country." The community of Cedar Falls had undergone its own examination of values and priorities following the federal investigation. Local businesses that had previously catered to popular students and their families found themselves reevaluating their relationships with customers who had enabled or ignored systematic harassment. The Veterans of Foreign Wars Post in Cedar Falls established a scholarship program specifically for children of deployed service members, ensuring that academic achievement and character would be recognized regardless of social status or family connections. The program became a model for other communities seeking to demonstrate genuine support for military families. "We learned that saying, 'support our troops,' isn't enough," explained VFW Post Commander retired Colonel James Patterson. "We have to back up those words with actions that protect and honor military families in our community." The media attention that had initially focused on the dramatic confrontation between Staff Sergeant Williams and the school administration had evolved into ongoing coverage of military family issues and community responsibility. National news programs featured Cedar Falls as an example of how communities could transform crisis into positive change. Educational researchers studying the case identified key factors that had enabled the harassment to continue undetected for so long, leading to policy recommendations that were adopted by school districts across the country. The comprehensive documentation that Staff Sergeant Williams had compiled became a template for other military families seeking to address similar issues. The Williams case demonstrated that military families don't have to accept substandard treatment from civilian institutions, explained Dr. Margaret Chen, who directed a university research center focused on military family issues. It showed that systematic documentation and strategic intervention could create lasting change that protects all students, not just military children. As Zara concluded her valedictorian speech, she looked directly at Jackson, Mason, and Dylan, who were attending the graduation ceremony as part of their community service requirements. The boys who had once terrorized her now listened respectfully as she articulated lessons about courage, accountability, and the power of standing up for what's right. "To anyone who thinks they're powerless to stop injustice," Zara said, her voice carrying across the packed auditorium, Remember that you're never as alone as you think you are. There are people who will stand with you when you find the courage to stand up for yourself. Sometimes those people are family members serving thousands of miles away. Sometimes they're teachers who care more than you realize. And sometimes they're classmates who are waiting for someone to show them that change is possible. The standing ovation that followed her speech included not just her family and friends, but former adversaries who had learned to respect the quiet strength that had ultimately transformed their entire community. As Zara Williams walked across the stage to receive her diploma, she carried with her the knowledge that her ordeal had created something larger than personal victory. It had created a legacy of accountability and protection that would benefit military families for generations to come. The final lesson of Zara Williams' story wasn't about the power of military intervention or the importance of parental advocacy, though both had been crucial to her protection. The ultimate lesson was about the transformation that occurs when communities choose to confront uncomfortable truths about their values and commit to creating environments where every child can succeed regardless of their background or their parents' service to the country. In a world where military families often felt isolated from the civilian communities they served to protect, Cedar Falls had become proof that understanding, respect, and genuine support could bridge any divide, if people had the courage to do what was right instead of what was easy. 3 years later, Zara Williams stood in the courtyard of the United States Naval Academy, her midshipman uniform crisp against the Maryland autumn air. The letter in her hands bore the official seal of the Department of Defense, notifying her that she had been selected to lead a new initiative focused on supporting military children in civilian schools across the nation. The program, officially designated as the Military Child Protection and Advocacy Initiative, had been inspired directly by her experience at Riverside High School. The comprehensive documentation that her father had compiled, combined with the successful intervention model he had implemented, had convinced military leadership that proactive protection was both possible and necessary. The irony, Zara wrote in her acceptance letter for the program, is that the worst experience of my high school career has become the foundation for what I hope will be the most meaningful work of my adult life. Every child who faces harassment because of their parents' service will have advocates and resources that I didn't know existed when I needed them most. The Naval Academy had proven to be the perfect environment for Zara's continued development as both a scholar and a leader. Her experience with systematic harassment and successful resistance had given her unique credibility with fellow midshipmen who came from challenging backgrounds. She had become the unofficial counselor for cadets struggling with imposter syndrome, social isolation, or the unique pressures of military academy life. Her academic focus had evolved into a double major in psychology and international relations, with a thesis project examining the intersection of military family welfare and national security readiness. The research had attracted attention from senior military leaders who recognized that supporting military families wasn't just a moral imperative but a strategic necessity for maintaining force readiness. Strong families create strong service members, Zara had testified before a Senate Armed Services Subcommittee during her sophomore year. When we protect military children from harassment and discrimination, we're investing in the next generation of Americans who understand the value of service and sacrifice. The transformation at Riverside High School had become a case study taught at military academies, war colleges, and civilian universities, studying conflict resolution and community transformation. The comprehensive documentation of both the problem and the solution had created a replicable model that other communities could adapt to their specific circumstances. Principal Morrison, who had initially survived the federal investigation, had eventually resigned to become a full-time consultant, helping other school districts implement military family support programs. Her presentation, From Crisis to Transformation, How One Military Family Changed Everything, had become one of the most requested workshops at educational conferences nationwide. I learned that being an educator means more than just teaching subjects, Morrison reflected during a presentation to aspiring school administrators. It means creating environments where every child can succeed, regardless of their family's circumstances or service to our country. The Williams family taught me that leadership sometimes means admitting you were wrong and committing to do better. The federal oversight that had been implemented at Riverside High School had gradually evolved into a voluntary certification program that schools across the country sought to achieve. The Military Family-Friendly School designation had become a mark of excellence that attracted both military families and civilian families who valued inclusive, supportive educational environments. Jackson Reed's transformation had continued through his college years at a state university where athletic scholarships weren't available to him. The loss of his expected football career had forced him to discover academic and personal strengths he had never developed during his years as a privileged athlete. His psychology degree had led to a career in military family counseling, where his personal experience with the destructive power of bullying had given him unique insights into helping both perpetrators and victims of harassment. The boy who had once terrorized a military child had become one of the military community's most effective advocates for preventing similar incidents. "I can't change what I did to Zara Williams," Jackson had written in his graduate school application essay, "but I can spend my career making sure other military children don't face what she endured. My experience as a bully taught me how harassment campaigns develop and escalate, which makes me effective at identifying and stopping them before they cause lasting damage." The counseling practice Jackson eventually established had grown into a regional center for addressing military family trauma, with specialized programs for children who had experienced harassment related to their parents' service. His waiting room displayed a framed copy of Zara's valedictorian speech, reminding both clients and staff that transformation was always possible. Mason Clark had channeled his physical presence and competitive drive into coaching youth sports in underserved communities, focusing particularly on programs that served military families stationed at nearby bases. His own experience with anger and poor decision-making had made him an effective mentor for young athletes struggling with similar issues. The sports programs Mason developed emphasized character development alongside athletic achievement, with strict zero-tolerance policies for any form of harassment or exclusion. Players who bullied teammates or opponents faced immediate suspension, while those who demonstrated leadership in supporting vulnerable players received recognition and additional coaching opportunities. "Sports taught me how to be part of a team," Mason explained to parents during a preseason meeting. "But I had to learn the hard way that real teamwork means protecting everyone on the team, not just the star players. Every kid in this program will learn that lesson from day one." Dylan Foster had applied his strategic intelligence to developing technological solutions for identifying and preventing cyberbullying before it could escalate to the level of harassment campaigns. His software company, Digital Guardian, had become a leading provider of artificial intelligence systems that monitored online communications for patterns associated with systematic harassment. The irony that the boy who had orchestrated digital harassment campaigns was now protecting children from similar attacks wasn't lost on Dylan, who frequently spoke at technology conferences about the ethical responsibilities of digital natives. "Technology is just a tool," Dylan explained during a keynote presentation to software developers. "It can be used to destroy lives or to protect them. I learned the hard way which choice I wanted to make, but every person in this room still has the opportunity to choose protection over destruction." The software systems Dylan developed had been adopted by school districts across the country, creating an early warning network that could identify harassment campaigns before they reached crisis levels. The system that had failed to protect Zara Williams had evolved into a protective infrastructure that safeguarded thousands of military children nationwide. Brittany Wells had discovered academic talents that had been overshadowed by her focus on social popularity during high school. Her college experience had introduced her to social work, where her understanding of group dynamics and social exclusion had made her an effective advocate for marginalized students. Her master's thesis on female-led harassment in educational settings had become required reading in social work programs nationwide. The research had revealed that girls' aggression, while different from boys' physical intimidation, could be equally devastating and required specialized intervention strategies. "I thought leadership meant being the center of attention," Brittany reflected during a presentation to high school counselors. "I learned that real leadership means using your influence to include people, not exclude them. Every girl who uses social media to hurt someone else is making the same mistake I made." Dr. Angela Williams had parlayed her medical expertise and personal experience into a national leadership role in military family advocacy. Her appointment to the Defense Health Board had given her a platform to influence policy at the highest levels of military leadership, ensuring that the lessons learned from her daughter's experience would benefit military families worldwide. The medical practice she had built in Cedar Falls had evolved into a model for providing culturally competent healthcare to military families, with specialized programs for addressing the unique stressors faced by children of deployed service members. Her research on the health impacts of military family harassment had influenced both military and civilian healthcare protocols. Medical providers often see the physical symptoms of stress without understanding the underlying causes, Dr. Williams explained during a presentation to military medical personnel. When we treat a military child for anxiety or depression, we need to ask whether harassment or discrimination might be contributing factors. Staff Sergeant Williams, now promoted to gunnery sergeant, had become a senior instructor at the Marine Corps Leadership Development Programs, where his intervention at Riverside High School had become a case study in protective leadership and strategic problem-solving. His presentation, Mission Protect the Home Front, had become a standard component of leadership training for Marines preparing for deployment. The message was clear. Protecting military families required the same strategic thinking and decisive action that Marines applied to combat operations. Every Marine who deploys leaves family members on the home front, Gunnery Sergeant Williams explained to junior Marines. Those family members face unique challenges that require our protection and advocacy. We can't defend freedom overseas while allowing our own children to be terrorized at home. The military family advocacy network that had emerged from the Williams case had grown into a comprehensive support system with chapters at every major military installation. The network provided resources, training, and rapid response capabilities for military families facing harassment or discrimination in civilian communities. As Zara Williams prepared to graduate from the Naval Academy and begin her career as a Marine officer, she carried with her the knowledge that her personal ordeal had created systemic changes that would protect thousands of military children she would never meet. The quiet girl who had once tried to become an invisible hand instead became a beacon of hope for military families nationwide. The letter from the Secretary of Defense, personally thanking her for her contribution to military family welfare, would join her father's medals and her grandfather's flag in the display case that honored her family's tradition of service. But the real monument to her courage wasn't found in official recognition. It was found in every military child who would attend school without fear because of the changes her experience had inspired. In her final reflection for the Naval Academy's Leadership Journal, Zara wrote, "Strength isn't about never being knocked down. Strength is about getting back up, speaking truth to power, and making sure that your experience protects others from facing the same battles. Every challenge we overcome has the potential to become someone else's victory." The story that had begun with food thrown at a quiet girl in a high school cafeteria had evolved into a legacy of protection, accountability, and transformation that would endure for generations. In the end, the bullies had succeeded in making Zara Williams visible, but her visibility had become a force for justice that they never could have imagined. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.